6 men. Dropped into the jungle by helicopter in the middle of the night. No artillery within range. No quick reaction force standing by. No reinforcements anywhere within reach. Their orders were to move silently through territory held by an enemy that outnumbered them by thousands, observe everything, report back, and under no circumstances make a sound unless their position was already known. They would be out there for a week, sometimes 3 weeks. If something went wrong, the best case was a very loud, very brief firefight before the helicopters arrived. The realistic case was worse than that. Between 1965 and 1972, the U.S. Army ran hundreds of these missions across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The soldiers who carried them out were called Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol teams, LRRPs, pronounced LRRPs. They were among the most highly trained men in the U.S. military at that point in history, operating under conditions that have no real equivalent in conventional infantry service. Their casualty rates in certain units and certain periods reached numbers that take a moment to process. Some LRRP companies reported that over the course of a year-long operational rotation, every man in the unit had either been wounded, killed, or extracted under fire at least once. In several documented cases, the rate was higher than that, and almost nobody outside the military community knows this story in any real detail. To understand what the job actually was, you need to understand what the U.S. military needed and could not get from conventional sources. By the mid-1960s, American commanders were fighting a war against an enemy that operated by entirely different rules. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong did not hold fixed lines, did not wear uniforms that made them visible at a distance, and did not mass in formations that conventional reconnaissance could locate and track before they dispersed again. They moved through jungle that American aircraft could not see through, along routes that appeared on no maps. Aerial photography, signals intercepts, and prisoner interrogation all produced information that was often days old before it could be acted on. The commanders needed eyes on the ground, close to the enemy, watching in real time. That was the assignment these teams were given. The insertion itself was the first moment of maximum exposure. Teams typically flew in on UH-1 helicopters at low altitude and high speed, inserting at last light or in the first hour of darkness. The helicopter did not land. It hovered 2 or 3 feet above the ground for 10 to 15 seconds while the team jumped clear, then accelerated away before anyone on the ground could visually track where it had gone. Experienced insertion pilots flew multiple false insertions at nearby clearings before and after the real one, trying to prevent observers in the tree line from identifying which clearing had actually received the team. Even with those precautions, compromised insertions happened. A team that came under fire before it could move from the landing zone was in the worst possible situation. No established position, no cover, and an enemy that knew its exact location. The first several minutes after insertion, before the team could penetrate the jungle and begin building distance from the clearing, was a window of vulnerability that training could reduce, but not eliminate. The concept drew from the experience of World War II long-range penetration units, and from Special Forces doctrine developed through the 1950s. The idea was direct. Send a very small team deep behind enemy lines, keep them undetected, and have them report everything they observed. Artillery coordinates, supply routes, troop concentrations, movement patterns along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the size and direction of units preparing to attack. A 6-man LRRP team in the right position, staying invisible, could produce actionable intelligence in real time that a full infantry battalion could not safely collect at all. That asymmetry, tiny team, outsized intelligence value, was the entire foundation of the program. The men who went on these missions were not ordinary infantry handed a harder task. They were volunteers, almost exclusively. Men who had sought this out specifically, who had qualified as paratroopers in most cases before volunteering for LRRP service, and who then completed additional selection and training focused entirely on fieldcraft and small unit covert movement. The training was intense and specific. It covered how to move through dense vegetation without leaving trace evidence, how to cross rivers and streams without disturbing the surface in ways a tracker could read, how to construct a patrol base in heavy jungle that would be undetectable from a few meters away. It covered immediate action drills, the precisely choreographed responses to contact that gave 6 men their best chance of breaking clean from a force that dramatically outnumbered them. And it put heavy emphasis on communication, because the radio operator was the team's only connection to everything that could save them. A standard LRRP team had 6 men, a team leader, an assistant team leader, a point man, a radio operator, and 2 others with secondary roles. The radio operator held a particular position in the team's hierarchy of risk. In any firefight with trained opposing forces, the standard tactical response was to kill the radio operator first. Cutting communication isolated the team, prevented them from calling in fire support or extraction, and gave the surrounding force time to tighten the cordon before help could arrive. Every man on every LRRP team understood this. It meant that every mission included a sustained, low-level awareness, never quite at the surface but never gone either, that the man with the radio was the primary target the moment the team was identified. The preparation for each mission consumed the days before insertion and was as precisely structured as anything the teams did in the field. Intelligence officers briefed team leaders on known enemy unit locations and likely patrol routes in the area of operations. Teams spent hours studying aerial photographs of the terrain they would be moving through, trying to identify usable cover, water sources, defensible patrol base sites, and the clearing options they would need if extraction had to happen somewhere other than the planned landing zone. Team leaders memorized a minimum of 3 alternate extraction points, with their grid coordinates committed to memory, rather than written down. A written grid coordinate found on a captured soldier told the enemy exactly where the team expected to be recovered. Every document that went into the field had to be evaluated from the perspective of what it would reveal if it ended up in the wrong hands. Most teams carried nothing on paper that they could avoid carrying. The rules of engagement for most LRRP teams compressed to a single practical instruction: do not fire first. The mission was reconnaissance. Opening fire revealed the team's location, immediately destroyed whatever intelligence value they had built up by staying hidden, and began a contact scenario in which 6 men would be engaging a force that vastly outnumbered them, with no prepared defensive position and limited ammunition. The directive was to evade. If evasion was not possible and the team was in contact, they would fight toward a clearing or ridgeline, get on the radio under fire, transmit a grid coordinate, and hold until aircraft arrived. The interval between transmitting and having the first helicopter overhead ran from 10 minutes in ideal conditions to much longer when assets were unavailable or already committed. The extraction was the moment that killed more LRRP soldiers than anything else. Getting a UH-1 or a Chinook into a contested landing zone, the aircraft slow and highly visible, the team possibly reduced to 3 or 4 effective men trying to hold a perimeter in jungle they had not chosen and could not see through, was the scenario veterans describe most consistently when asked about the worst moments of their service. Helicopter crews who flew combat extractions have described landing in clearings where tracer fire was converging from multiple directions and sitting on the ground while the team fought toward the aircraft, knowing that the longer they stayed on the ground, the easier they were to destroy. Some aircraft did not fly out of those clearings. The crews and the teams inside them did not leave either. The emergency extraction protocol for teams that were surrounded and could not reach a landing zone was called prairie fire. Transmitting prairie fire triggered an immediate maximum effort response. Gunships, fast movers, jet fighters armed with bombs and rockets, and extraction helicopters, all diverting simultaneously from whatever they were doing. Prairie fire meant the team was minutes from being overrun. In good conditions, the first aircraft could be overhead in under 10 minutes. Whether that was fast enough depended entirely on what was already happening on the ground. The psychological reality of this work comes through in what the men who did it have written and said since the war. A LRRP team that had located an enemy force they could not engage would go completely to ground, hiding in vegetation, lying still, and waiting. The waiting could last hours. There are multiple first-hand accounts of teams lying motionless while NVA soldiers moved through the same piece of jungle, close enough to hear individual conversations, close enough in some instances that a man could have reached out and made contact with the soldiers passing by. In those situations, 6 people's survival depended entirely on each of them maintaining complete physical and psychological stillness for as long as necessary. No shifting, no coughing, no reaction to insects, no involuntary sound of any kind. Veterans of multiple LRRP missions describe a specific form of attunement to jungle environments that developed over time. A calibrated sensory awareness that went well beyond what they describe as trained alertness. They could read the difference between natural animal movement and human movement in undergrowth at considerable distance. They knew the smell of an NVA base camp. They could move through heavy vegetation in darkness without producing the sounds that untrained movement in that environment inevitably generates. They also describe the difficulty of switching that level of vigilance off after extraction. The intrusive recall of specific near-contact moments that surfaced without warning years afterward. The habitual positioning and scanning behavior that persisted long after there was no longer anything to scan for. The question of who would break under sustained close contact pressure, and how the teams identified this before it became a problem in the field, was something the LRRP community handled largely outside the visibility of the conventional army. A man who could not maintain complete stillness and silence during a close enemy situation was a direct physical threat to the other 5 members of his team. The small unit selection process was correspondingly unforgiving. Men who did not demonstrate the required composure and training were removed from teams before deployment, typically without formal administrative process and without extended explanation. The conventional army had tolerance for performance problems that could be managed over time. A 6-man team operating 20 miles inside enemy-held territory did not. The standard was functional or it was not, and the consequences of discovering which it was in the wrong place were not recoverable. The intelligence value of what these teams produced was not peripheral to the Vietnam War. It was central to some of the most significant targeting operations the U.S. military ran. LRRP teams identified the locations of major NVA units before multiple large conventional engagements, provided targeting data that made B-52 arc light strikes precise rather than approximate, and tracked supply route activity along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in ways that aerial surveillance could not replicate. Single-team reports led directly to strikes that eliminated supply concentrations large enough to affect NVA operational capacity in specific regions for weeks. The teams that generated that intelligence were typically extracted under fire the same day they transmitted it. By 1969, the Army had consolidated most long-range patrol capability into companies formally designated under the 75th Infantry Regiment, the lineage that runs directly to today's 75th Ranger Regiment. Before that consolidation, individual divisions ran their own LRRP detachments with varying levels of support. Some had aviation assets whose crews had trained specifically for LRRP extraction and knew what a hot LZ with a compromised team required. Others flew missions with whatever was available, and the difference in outcomes tracked closely with the difference in preparation. The most classified long-range operations of the war were not run by divisional LRRP units. ACVSOG, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, ran deep reconnaissance and direct action missions into Laos and Cambodia under authorities that the U.S. government officially denied at the time. SOG teams combined Special Forces soldiers with indigenous fighters and operated in denied territory, conducting missions the government did not acknowledge for decades. The casualty rates in certain SOG projects were extraordinary, even measured against standard LRRP loss figures. Project Delta, which ran some of the earliest and most dangerous deep reconnaissance operations of the war, suffered losses in specific periods that accounted for a substantial portion of the project's entire operational strength in those windows. The men who volunteered for this work were not indifferent to risk. They were people who had made a specific and considered choice about what kind of service they wanted to render, and who found something in the 6-man team environment that conventional infantry did not offer. The intensity of small team interdependence. 6 people whose survival in any given moment depended on the judgment and self-control of each of the other 5, created bonds that veterans describe as the defining relationships of their lives, not despite what they required, but in direct relation to it. The gap between what these teams accomplished and the acknowledgement they received is not a small one. Large conventional operations generated press coverage and durable public memory. LRRP teams operated in classification and obscurity. Their missions were not reported. Their losses disappeared into aggregate statistics that did not distinguish between how men had died or what they had been attempting. Some veterans spent decades unable to discuss their service at all because their operations remained classified. Others found that the nature of the work, 6 men, dense jungle, 3 weeks, no witnesses outside the team itself, simply did not translate into the kind of story that moved through civilian culture in recognizable form. The 75th Ranger Regiment carries this history. Michael Lee Lanning's writing on LRRP operations, Gary Linderer's accounts of service with the 101st Airborne's LRRP Company, and John Plaster's documentation of MACVSOG are the most detailed first-hand sources available for this period. The National Archives holds after-action reports from hundreds of individual missions, many of them now declassified. The team that inserted with a week's rations, a radio, and orders to stay invisible. That was the unit of action the entire LRRP program existed to support. Everything else, the training pipelines, the extraction doctrine, the classified reporting chains, was built to keep those 6 men effective long enough to come home and go out again. Some of them came home. Some of them did not. The ones who did not are the reason the ones who did keep talking about it.